Assalamu alaikum and Ramadan Mubarak. Um, this is Critical Talk. Back again in the midst of Ramadan with two of my favoriteest people, Dr. Laith Saud, who is being a scholar and an author at Southern in Hyde Park, Illinois, and Professor Scott Hibbard, who is an associate professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at DePaul University. Our topic this evening is global Islamic awareness, which is so appropriate. I think this is Women's History Month. And two young ladies I was reading earlier, and I'm not sure where, um, young women, high school age, were attacked. And I think so many things have gone off the chain that we are going to have a good time this evening. Um, I asked you to consider some things. We've been talking about um, Islamophobia for what, over 2 decades now? Nothing has happened. I mean, I don't know what we need to do except have more instances of issues for things to change. Uh, the there African Americans and Latino Americans for a long time thought it didn't apply to them until they found out that it did. Uh, they thought it was only immigrant Americans, and then some particular immigrant Americans, Iraqis and Palestinians and Syrians. And then they found out it was much larger than that. Um, what do we do? Those voices uh, have implied that there's unparalleled violence. And I think with our current government, the violence is going to go off the chains. It's an unfounded hatred, both ways, by the way. And one hatred based on I'm tired of you picking me out, and the other hatred based on I'm scared of you, so I'm going to kill you first. How do we unpack all of the stuff swirling around the issue of what is truly a global Islamophobia? Either of you can start.
Scott, do you mind if I jump in here?
Please, no, go. Go.
So, Amina, great to see you. Scott, great to see you too. Always a pleasure to catch up with two of my favorite people as well. So, thanks for the opportunity, Amina. I'm always happy to be here. So, I think to a degree, I do not entirely agree with your premise that nothing has happened. So, allow me to explain. Scott and I, just before we went on camera, we were talking about the current climate in the United States, and it has some echoes of the post 9/11 environment, particularly we're talking about post October 7th environment. And certainly I feel certain emotions, memories, remnants of what it felt like post 9/11. However, I could not argue in good faith, I guess for another way of putting it. I could not argue that nothing has happened from 9/11 all the way until 2025. In fact, I would argue that with the election of Donald Trump, what was the first time around 2016?
Yeah.
It was a radical paradigmatic shift in Islamophobia that had very little to do with civil rights groups, activists, even scholars such as ourselves, although I think maybe we did a great job in the classroom disabusing students of maybe prejudices they had on of Muslims or Islam. But on a wide scale, in terms of media, there was a paradigmatic shift in 2016, and I call it the Trump toxic effect. Democrats and liberals are so repulsed by Donald Trump. When Donald Trump takes a position, they would sort of in a reactionary fashion almost take an opposite position. So when Donald Trump famously gave that interview to Anderson Cooper and he says, well, Islam hates us, they want to kill us, we got to figure out what's going on. All of a sudden, every Democrat and every liberal their hearts opened up to Muslims, and you found The women who wore hijab or things like that, they were at the front of the protests, they were at the front of the parade, they were at the front of the stage. Whereas during even the Obama administration, people who were visibly Muslim, quote unquote, were often removed off camera so that they wouldn't be seen behind Barack Obama, implying that Obama had large Muslim support because Obama saw that as a political liability. Democrats all of a sudden starting to put Muslims front and center after Trump was elected. So I do think things changed, and I don't think that we've gone back to a pre-2016 United States. I think that when we look at some of the discourses that have emerged after October 7th, we still find Democrats are by and large more pro-Palestinian than they are pro-Israel in very general terms. I get it, Amin. I see you shaking your head. I understand. But if you poll Democrats, particularly younger Democrats, you're going to find that they're more generally speaking, broad strokes, pro-Palestinian than they were pro-Israel. I don't know if I would have said that in 2007, 2009, 2012. So I don't think we're there. However, I do think that there is an effort being made to reassert sort of that 2006 to 2012 idea of Islam. I've been following social media very closely, including posts by other academics. I mean, I saw one today in which it said, radical Islam is penetrating every pillar of American society. I thought, really? Wow. Like, how? How would you explain that? Radical Muslims control the media? Radical Muslims control universities? I mean, should I go on? It's an absurd premise, and it's fear-mongering. It's something you would have heard back in 2009 and 2010. But I think back then, people were more credulous, and it actually resonated more. There was more fear. I do believe now there's a significant part of the United States that is far more critical of that kind of narrative. They see it as propagandistic. They see it as a distraction from the powers that be. So I don't. Of course, there's Islamophobes. Of course, there's an Islamophobic element to certain policies in which would enable those policies to move further. However, I don't think the American public at large has an Islamophobia problem the way they did between, say, 2001 and 2016.
Yeah. So let me pick on a couple points that that Laith laid out. One is the fear mongering. Like there is always this challenge of the other, whether back in the day it was the German enemy from within or the Huns, and then of course there was always the racial issue. African Americans were seen as a threatening minority, and after 9/11, one could argue that it goes back to 1979, the Iranian Revolution, but really 9/11, a very highly integrated population, the Muslim community, particularly from Syria and Lebanon, became very, just distinctly otherized. And a lot of the ways in which the war on terror was sold to continue to demonize this enemy other as a way of justifying the foreign policies that were the Bush administration was promoting. And that really laid the groundwork for kind of the rise of this far right Islamophobic right. And it's kind of ebbed and flowed since that moment. Interestingly, there's a colleague of mine, Joseph Margulies. He wrote a book called "What Changed When Everything Changed," and basically the gist of his argument is the Islamophobia really didn't take off until Bush left office. And it was really when Bush left office, because he was always talking about the problem's not Islam, the problem is Islam is the militants, extremists. But once he's gone and Obama is now president, many of the people within within the Republican Party and the think tanks became more free to demonize Muslims and to kind of paint Obama as part of this this Islamic Sharia promoting agenda. And that's really where you get kind of what I would say kind of the Christian extremists who started making these kind of wild allegations that the Muslim Brotherhood is trying to infiltrate our constitution and change our laws. And And it's kind of laughable in some respects, but it was taken very seriously within certain quarters of American society, particularly within the evangelical right. And Trump rode that to the White House. I mean, it's not the only thing, but he was willing to to kind of use that fear mongering, targeting a minority within our midst, demonizing them, and using that as a way of kind of pulling in supporters. And again, it waxes and wanes. And you're muted. It waxes and wanes. And I think during the Biden era it was definitely diminished, but now we see it kind of resurfacing once again. Although I would argue also the Syrian diaspora, or the Syrian civil war, and pushed so much of the Syrians out of the country, did create the migration crisis, and that immigration and Islamophobia really became very much intertwined at that moment in time.
I think Scott and Laith, I'm just going to mix this up a little bit. I think that, of course, you have your dates right, but I think it started before that. I think there are two levels. There's that academic level where you all see things in those wonderful big terms that I variously don't know what they mean anymore. And then there's the on the ground level. And what I see is, and I'm sure that they were not the beginning, but when there became something called the moral majority, or that magnet, that document, the magnet, something or the other, Carter, um, that there's always been a push for white supremacy. On the other hand, in the 60s, in communities, Muslims themselves were talking about taking over America. So you can't be talking about taking over America and then wanting to condemn the people who say you're talking about wanting to take over America. I mean, I used to save the pamphlets, and then it got to be too much about America is immoral, is the shaitan, and we need to set her on the right course. I mean, Egyptian and Iraqi and Syrian, probably store owners, were coming into America, setting up communities. And this kind of rhetoric was being patterned around, and lots of people took it for the Islamic mission. On the other hand, Lath made a distinction earlier between Democrats and liberal. I don't know what a liberal is. And if there is a such thing, he is surely in need of hospitalization. Democrats have proven to be the party of, yes, we will do whatever you say. So I don't know if we have really two parties, or we have two folks of the same coin presenting different faces. It seems to me, in the periods Lath was talking about, where the Democrats opened something or the other, they didn't really open anything. They wanted to look like they did. On the other hand, Republicans, since, I mean, unfortunately for me and my lives, I read Project 2025. It's been around for a minute. Nobody chose to believe it. And it's a choose to believe, or believed it and said, okay, if I don't open my mouth, people won't pay it any attention. What's going on, guys?
Okay, so
Go to it.
there's a lot there. Okay, so first let me
Yeah.
start with the very initial thing that you talked about in the 1960s. The first thing I would have pointed to actually would probably be the nation, and Muslims who belong to the nation, certainly talking about taking over parts of America, because they actually insisted on segregation, and they thought that segregation was actually more empowering for the African American community. I am not aware of, beyond anecdotally, maybe immigrant Muslims talking about taking over America. But
Oh,
there's
man.
sure, fine.
Loads of pamphlets.
But there is included in included in the premise. I won't say your premise, but there is included in the premise who is entitled to claim, who is more entitled to be able to talk about taking over America. I mean, that's exactly what MAGA wants, right? In many ways, that's what Democrats, people want their vision to take over America. And nobody's particularly
Exactly.
more entitled than one person or the other, unless you presume that some people are more entitled than the other. And as long as you're an American citizen, that presumption should not be broken down along ethnic, religious, or class lines, right? So that's set aside. I mean, it was the 60s. People were smoking pot and stuff and talking about,
They're still
Buddhism,
smoking pot.
Buddhism taking over America and all this and all that. So but maybe that part's okay. But the Democrat liberal distinction in talking about the Democrats, Scott's going to hate me for saying this, but I truly feel the Democratic Party has revealed itself to be essentially nothing but the controlled opposition. Okay? The Republican Party is more openly pro-corporation, corporate values, interests of big corporate, and the Democratic Party plays this role as the opposition to that, but in fact is nothing more than an extension of corporate interests.
Exactly.
It is, at this point, the Democratic Party is much like Joe Biden, out of touch and ineffective, and they're in serious, serious trouble. I think what I was talking about earlier, when I said that the Democrats sort of co-opted Muslims after 2016 or thereabouts, it was precisely in that fashion. It's in this fashion of, we're the minority party, and we appeal to you. We don't appeal to the white Christian, and in fact, in many ways, it's just, in my opinion, it's become that. I have to apologize. This is horrible, but I have to grab a computer charger. Okay, and I failed to do that. So give me 1 minute, Scott. Maybe you could take it away while I do this. I apologize for that, Amma.
I know, but I want to respond to your comment. A couple of thoughts. One is, yes, back in the 60s, there was, the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X, talking about asserting themselves, yada, yada, yada. But they weren't, the kind of viable force that was actually going to, take over the country. And I think more to the point, I mean, this is your area. This is your era, not mine. But again, kind of fast forwarding to more contemporary period, there have been all these claims on the political right that the nation, or that the Muslim Brotherhood is surreptitiously infiltrating the U.S. and promoting their vision of kind of a hostile takeover over the American government. And they're doing it with complicity of the Democratic Party and people like Barack Obama. There's a very short pamphlet written by a guy named Andrew McCarthy talking about the Shariaization of the United States and how Obama is abetting it. And this is part of the narrative, and it's it creates a caricature of the Islamist forces in the U.S. and portrays them as really on par with any other major political force in the United States, threatening the civilization of the country. And in my mind, it's really ludicrous, because it's kind of creating this phantom menace that you're organizing your population against, and you're trying to tar the other side, liberals, Democrats, everybody, as being kind of complicit in the Shariaization. And it's really only the good Christian patriots who stand by Donald Trump that are going to win their country back, and that's part of that Trumpian narrative of demonizing the others and immobilizing forces. Just one quick comment about the Dems. I used to work for the members of Congress in the Democratic Party. You really look at both the Republican and the Democratic Party is really kind of a coalition of factions, and they're really all over the map. And you can even argue that in this country, there's probably 4 or 5 major political parties, but because of the way in which we don't have a proportional representation system, it's a traditional parliamentarian system, we got to have these, national parties. So, the left is kind of cobbled together into a kind of a corporate, centrist, progressive wing, and then the right is kind of the pro corporates, and then evangelical and far right. And what's interesting about the Republican Party right now is it really has been taken over by the far right. And the Democrats are still kind of warring amongst themselves between like the Bernies and the AOCs and the Chuck Schumers and the Bidens, and they don't really know. And this is one of the reasons why they're having such a hard time responding to the Trumpian moment, because they're fractured.
But the thing is, I think that that President Obama represented the exhaustion of the Clintonian Democratic Party, right?
Yeah, well, I think Obama was.
Aminah, you wanted to ask something? What the hell's that?
Yeah, what is a Clintonian
moment.
Democratic Party?
Well, so one of the things that kind of cater to, or the essence of Clinton's success, is he was able to transcend a lot of the traditional debates within American society by pursuing what he referred to as the third way. So historically in America, you got capital versus labor, and that used to be the Republican Party versus the Democratic parties, capital versus labor, and Clinton represented kind of a new way, the third way of free trade Democrats. That we can have our cake and eat it too. We can be pro corporate, pro labor, and be kind of progressive, and if the economy booms, a rising tide will lift all boats. And on paper, in theory, it works well. Fast forward 20 years, I think what we've realized is the kind of economic policies that that Clinton embraced and the Democrats embraced, led to kind of deindustrialization of the upper Midwest. And a lot of people that vote for Trump are people that were losers in that process. I mean, they lost out in that process. Now, I would argue that the actual policies were promoted or kind of institutionalized by Ronald Reagan. And what Clinton did is he stopped fighting the neoliberal economic paradigm and tried to co-opt it. And that's kind of in that, in some respects, that is the agenda that Laith argues was kind of because it wore itself out in the 90s. I think when Obama came in, it was definitely, there was a recognition that we needed to ameliorate the downside of that neoliberal economic agenda. And unfortunately for Obama, the easy part was getting elected. The hard part was actually governing in a context where you didn't control the House and the Senate. And the Senate was controlled by Mitch McConnell, who did everything he could to undermine, Obama's administration.
Don't you think that kind of, back and forth and who controls what has almost been there in lots of ways, but I think that the general public is very confused by left of what, right of whom, because there are people on both sides and some mix. If the Democratic Party has become so fractured it can't do anything, then maybe it should become more than one party.
Okay.
Because the Republicans and all of their lunacy have no problem being on the same page, or if not on the same page, quieted.
Yeah. Let me just throw out a comment, and then Laith, I don't mean to cut you off because I know you've got comments on this. So one of the things that was really amazing about the first 2 years of the Biden administration is they got a lot of stuff done, and they got a lot of stuff done for mid-America. It killed me that Kamala Harris did not run on their economic agenda. They passed bills to bring manufacturing back to the United States. He was the most pro-labor, pro-union president we've had in 2 generations. And for one reason or another, the Democrats were not able to get through to the American public. Now, I think part of it is, again, we have a fractured media ecosystem. And, the right wing is talking about what a terrible economy, Biden's got, blah, 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 blah. And the reality is, when he left office, inflation was down to 4%. Employment, growth was at, over 2%. The recession that everyone predicted never materialized. I mean, there's all kinds of wins, and again, much of what he was doing was he was abandoning that neoliberal economic agenda that defined the Reagan era and was tried co-opted by the Clinton era, and he went back to a kind of an industrial policy that we're going to start investing in strategic areas and strategic industry, and we're going to bring America back. The irony is, Donald Trump's now taking it apart in the name of bringing America back, and it's going to be a disaster. But
Well, I mean, I got to talk about the elephant in the room. I think Biden would have won handily. I mean, there was two factors: his age and his performance there at the end certainly did him no favors. But quite frankly, it was Gaza,
yeah,
and I think he would have won handily had they be able to get some sort of grip on what was happening in Gaza. And I also want to predict to both of you, and I want you both to remember this when it does happen, that the Republican Party is soon going to face fissure and fraction over policy on Israel. And there is a movement amongst the far right now that is seriously.
Who is the far right?
Well, seriously, vocally, America first. So
Okay.
if I were to take one person as an example who currently serves in Congress, it'd be Thomas Massey of Kentucky, right? Here's a libertarian who is diehard America first and who refuses to take money from AIPAC. And somewhat famously so. He's been on Tucker Carlson. He's been on other podcasts. You're seeing other conservatives like Candace Owen. And there has become a significant epistemic break at the far right of the Republican Party on the issue of Israel, in which before, certainly since 9/11, I mean, because before, all of us will recall in the 1980s, the Democrats were really the pro-Israel party, and the Republicans were far more measured and critical. Then with the demise of George H.W. Bush in politics, that is, there was a shift. And with George W. Bush, the Republicans emerged as sort of the pro-Israel party, much of that aligned with the war on terror. And I think now that identity is in decline, or at the very least, it's being challenged at the far right, who think that I don't want to give money to Ukraine. I don't want to give money to Israel. I don't want to give money to anybody. We are America first. We're pro-America, and they're very serious about that policy. So bottom line is, I see both parties going through transmutations. I think the Democratic Party is deeper in that transmutation and, in fact, risks breaking up because it has failed. But the Republican Party, that challenge is not far down along the road, where they're going to have serious internal conversations about the identity of the party moving forward.
Yeah. A quick comment on just a response to that. One of the interesting twists of history is that George W. Bush in the 2000 election did a lot of outreach to Arab Americans, and they were tapping into a lot of the disgruntlement that the Arab Americans had with the Clinton role in the Oslo peace process. They thought that they were too pro-Israel, and many of the Arab Americans, including a Palestinian former Arabic teacher of mine, they voted for Bush because they thought George H.W. Bush, the father, actually did hold the Israeli government's feet to the fire when it came to like settlements and things. And so they thought that that Bush might be better. And then of course 9/11 happens, and they're all like, "Oh my God, what did I do?" So,
it's funny. I mean, there could be sort of a recurring of that.
Yeah,
many Arab Americans either they withheld their vote for Kamala, or which was a tacit vote for Trump, or they actually voted for Trump because they were upset over the Gaza policy. And now
I want to come back to that. I want to take a quick break, even though I'm late, and come back to some of the things that the two of you are saying, which I think is so important in terms of defining terms for our audience. This is Aminah Al-Deen for Critical Talk, which is a production of Sound Vision, and me and my two wonderful, really good friends, Professors Scott Hibbard and Laith Saud, will be right back with you. Good evening again. This is Professor Aminah Al-Deen with Critical Talk, a production of Sound Visions and Muslim Network TV. And I'm here having a late evening chat with two very good friends, Professors Laith Saud and Scott Hibbard. I think, one of the things that happens is, and both of you have mentioned it, is that folks are just out of touch. I think the Republican Party doesn't want to be in touch. They have an agenda that, just transcends touchiness. Democrats, today in the middle of the day, I said, I'm not voting for any in the House or the Senate ever again as long as I live. I have never seen such wussiness. Trump says run, and you say how fast and to which poll, no matter what. And it's not just control of Congress, it's mm, an oblique control of the Supreme Court. There is some folk have seen this as a nation where they could come to and just live. On the other hand, they have come and demanded to keep an identity other than American. I'm on the margins and all of that. Um, and that necessarily makes the people who think that they own it itchy. Wonderful. I have never seen so many things. I mean, I thought I knew what presidential powers were. I give up. I mean, they're all over everywhere. And this thing of retaliation and I'm gonna get you back. It's like kids playing out in the street. And then the Democrats curl up, and we're still talking about Democrats and liberals. I still don't get the distinction. I don't know what we mean by conservative, because everybody is probably conservative about some things and liberal about others, depending upon what you're talking about on Wednesday. But I need for you guys to tell me what what are the prospects for Muslims. Muslims aren't always honest brokers. Everybody wants their, and I don't know if you call it a homeland, their area, their geographic area of preference, to have some preference, right? That can't happen. And I think Americans demonstrate. I have to admit, I was half in shock and half not in shock when we looked at the number of Muslims, Arab, and others who voted for Trump. What did good did they think was going to happen for them? Because it's not finished happening. And instead of having a plan, we are the reactionary folk. Summa cum laude. With the top of that. Talk to me.
So, yeah, quickly, Scott, sorry to jump in like this, but I actually in 2016, and particularly in 2020, wrote articles for the Chicago Monitor arguing that more minorities were going to vote for Trump than analysts assumed. Now, the question is why? What did they think they were going to get out of it? And I think, honestly, it's more of a protest vote against the Democratic Party. People are, quite frankly, fed up with the Democratic Party. And I think probably the biggest moment, the watershed moment, was when Bernie Sanders was essentially undermined against Hillary Clinton back in 2016. I think the Democrats have not reflected upon that and have not learned from that. And they seem insistent upon maintaining this edifice of a party that's committed to corporate goals, that takes corporate money in the exact same way that the Republicans do. So this is something that I've often, when I'm talking about Democrats and Republicans, this is often how I describe it. Each has a relationship with its constituents and has a particular contract with its constituents. And the Republican contract actually plays out. They're like, if you allow us to be capitalistic and poor corporate America, we will in turn allow you to continue to be religious and insist on a religious society, right? And they're like, good, we'll take it, right? As long as I can talk about Christ and keep Christ in schools and all the way up to a constitutional limit, essentially. I'll take that trade. I will take being pro-corporate, or at least at the very least, not be critical of corporate America and be critical of how it's affecting my pocketbook. But if you allow me to keep Christ in my heart and my family and on my street corner, you got a deal. It's for liberty. It's for the liberty to pursue, religiosity and faith. On the other side, for the Democrats, the deal is, if you vote for us, then we're going to show you get equality, not liberty. But when you start to break down the quality of that equality, when you start to look at the nature of that equality, it's not a material equality. It's like this kind of cultural equality. We're going to police the way people talk. We're going to ensure you're not offended. It's highly superficial.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to the origins epistemologically and politically of what a progressive is supposed to be, that equality is supposed to be material. It's supposed to be greater equality in my pocketbook. It's supposed to be greater equality in my access to resources. And the Democratic Party has abandoned that equality a long time ago. And therefore, the contract doesn't hold up. And Democrats today are tired of signing off. I mean, when I say Democrats, I mean like people who would vote Democrat, are tired of signing off on a contract that's not paying the dividends that they expect. Sorry about that.
So, no. Let me just respond to a couple of points. The last one I think is really important. That historically Democrats were all about economic equality. And that was one of the big differences between Republicans and Democrats. Democrats, were pro-labor, arguing for higher livings or wages, and the idea was, it didn't matter. And somewhere along the way, we kind of shifted from maybe in a class-based, party, or the Democrats shifted from being a class-based party to being a community-based, party. So again, so there's much more focus on cultural issues, not not economic issues, and that's why a lot of Hispanics, a lot of the Hispanic youth all voted for Trump, because they don't like the woke DEI stuff. They don't see it as applying to them. So some Trump, that kind of resonated with Trump. Now, I would argue that part of the reason why the Democrats lost so first of all, it was not a blowout, but it's still a deeply divided nation. But the reason why so many members of minority populations in particular, voted for Trump is because of the disinformation. I mean, if you think about the end of the campaign, he was just saying everything to everybody, contradicting himself. He has no idea what Project 2025 is. It's written by extremists. He's going to bring down the price of eggs. He's going to do this. He's going to do this. He said what everybody wanted to hear, and they bought it. And supposedly there was some people, some Arab Americans in the Detroit area that had been promised, by this guy, former ambassador to Germany, Grinnell. He was Trump's envoy to that community, in the latter part of the campaign. That they were promised that he was going to be in the State Department, secretary, and they were shocked when Marco Rubio got appointed, and then they were really shocked when the other policies started being implemented, and anyway. So, but the kind of point is that that's part of what the reason why Trump won is there was just a lot of disinformation. And he was saying everything to everybody that they wanted to hear, and people they bought it, much to many people's regret now. Now, the last thing I'll just say, and this is kind of the larger issue I I think, is that, as a society, this brings us back to the Islamophobia. As a society, the United States has always grappled with what does it mean to be American, right? Are we really a truly multi-ethnic, multi-religious society where people treated equally under law and all that? Or at the end of the day, is this really a white Christian society where we tolerate minority populations? And I think the Democrats, to their credit, have embraced that notion of a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society.
They have what? Embraced what?
Well, they've embraced the idea that America really is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society. I'm not going to talk about a melting pot because I think that's too much. But there is at least they recognize the diversity of America, and they've tried to embrace the diversity of America.
Well, how can we understand that? One of the things, and that I like I said, I thought I knew the Constitution. There's no more freedom of speech. You can have supported somebody directly or indirectly in the past that voted against something Trump wanted to do and lose your job today. We got students, I forgot the young man's name, who is a citizen, who has a green card, who can get deported. And when we looked at the law, yes, he can. I mean, what constitution?
Okay, let me tell you, and I'll then let Laith follow up. So, on the one hand, many of the things that are happening right now are happening.
Can you
outside.
speak up a little bit, Scott?
Yes, sorry. So many of the things that are happening right now are happening outside the law. What Doge, Elon Musk's outfit, what they are doing, shutting down USAID, dismantling the Department of Education, this is outside the law. But there's no FBI, there's no Department of Justice, there's nobody to enforce the law. So this is why we're in a constitutional crisis. That there are actions being taken by the administration that are patently illegal or unconstitutional, but there's no enforcement mechanism to bring this back.
Well, then they're not patently illegal or unconstitutional if there's nobody to say,
to enforce it. Well,
hold up, back up.
So it doesn't mean that the law is not being broken. It just means that the law is not being enforced.
Okay, I'm slow.
Aminah, you're the one that used to take law classes at the law school.
No, but she raises
a point.
Students I know.
Don't do
an effective law.
Yeah.
Well, yes.
I'm really struggling with on an existential level, right? Like,
I don't know about existential, but I know it's a butt kicker.
No, but I've already sort of conceded in a cynical fashion that there's not going to be some great transcendent metaphysical justice on this earth.
So
maybe there is
now
in the beyond.
What happens in a
but I do want to believe that there is still law, and yet I'm finding increasingly that even when it comes to good old fashioned secular civil law, the twists and turns that people can take in order to be evasive and avoid it and claim you're applying it. So, for example, with Mahmoud Khalil, the student you were talking about, who's a green card holder, not a citizen. So he's a green card holder, which means he's entitled to certain civil rights, a fair amount.
Not really.
Well, okay, now we're getting to the philosophical point or to the practical point, but practically speaking, technically speaking, he is entitled to certain civil rights. He is entitled to due process. And now he clearly has been targeted for free speech. He's engaged in speech. Okay? He is not engaged in any violence. But the speech supposedly is aligned with Hamas, which in the United States is a terrorist organization. Hamas is, by law, designated a terrorist organization in the United States. So he has made speech that is aligned with Hamas. All right, so let me give you an analogy. let's pretend I'm a huge Bulls fan, which I'm more of an NFL guy. Scott knows I'm a diehard Lions fan, but for the purposes of explanation, let's say that in the 1990s, it was a diehard Bulls fan. I mean, we all loved Michael Jordan. And let's say Osama bin Laden loved Michael Jordan. And Osama bin Laden said, "Go Bulls." And then I say, "Go Bulls." Now all of a sudden I'm making a terrorist aligned statement.
Mm-hmm.
Now, fair enough. I'm exaggerating, right, to the nth degree in order to make the point that this alignment is highly problematic. But even let's say it was towards a political goal. Let's say that I wanted to see Puerto Rico become an independent state, right? No longer with its strained status and relationship to the United States that Scott could probably articulate better than I could. I said, no, I think, just as a matter of sort of universal principle, Puerto Rico is entitled to be its own sovereign state. I do believe there have been groups that have been designated as terrorist groups coming out of Puerto Rico. Now, all of a sudden, I'm a terrorist. It is an incredibly dangerous precedent that at face value, in terms of the spirit of the law, is illegal. This is completely un-American. And I want to be abundantly frank. In the early 2000s, as someone who is an American citizen of Iraqi descent, I used to openly say Iraq had a right to defend itself against the American invasion of Iraq. Openly. I'd say it on radio. I'd say it in articles, because I was trying to make it clear to the American public that, this is the invasion of a sovereign country. This is illegal. This is immoral. And they have a right to resist it. I never once feared, never once, somebody coming knocking on my door and hauling me away for that, because I felt as an American I was entitled. And it's one of the things I love about America. That's one of the things I am proud to be an American, is I never feared that. And now all of a sudden, we're doing that on behalf of a foreign country. And I think, again, this is another one of those watershed moments that is going to be a problem for the Republicans as much as the Democrats down the road, because we need to quickly disentangle our relationship with Israel in such a way as to preserve our valued American freedoms. I mean, just one last thing I'll say quickly. The only thing that distinguishes the United States from anywhere else in the world is our freedom of speech. It's not our economy. It's not our health care. It's not our access to education. It's not our roads. It's not our infrastructure. Maybe it's tax benefits if you're incredibly wealthy. Okay, this is the best place to be if you're really wealthy. But other than that, for us paupers out there, it's our freedom of speech. And the moment
used to be.
Forget about it.
Used to be.
Yeah,
Scott, I'm gonna give you the last word, but I'm gonna ask you to, because I think that this is an incredible historical moment in time, maybe a few moments. I want to come back and do some investigation. I talked to Scott about this last year of the Constitution. People, it doesn't say what people think it says. Its gaps have become oceans. Scott, I'm gonna give you the last word.
So there's a colleague of ours at the University of Chicago, Aziz Huq, and I saw him make a presentation one time, and he made a reference. The Constitution is like the Bible, frequently cited but seldom read. And I think this is part of the issue. We are in this really precarious moment because, historically, everybody respected the rule of law. Because going off on Laith's last point, it's not just freedom of speech that really defined this country, but it's really rule of law. I remember living in Egypt back in the day during the Mubarak era, and I remember coming back and somebody was asking me, it's like, well, what do you think about it? It's like, well, it's got pros and cons. It's like, but I'd never invest there because there's no rule of law. President's son, likes you got a good business. President's son comes in and says he's going to take over half of it. The rule of law is
our investigation, and I especially want to look at, write it down, guys, because you're older than me. The First, Fourth, 14th, and 15th Amendments. I really, I think they've been misinterpreted. There's ambiguous language there. I'm going to ask our producer to beg you all, and inshallah, I promise as best I can to be on time and not keep you up all night because I know you old people need your rest.
It's true.
That's true. We're not as young as
It
we
has
used to
been
be, Amina.
such a joy seeing both of you. And
too.
in this, I wanted to give folk a moment to look at, there's always, the bully always has a flurry of stuff he throws at you, trying to see what's going to stick. And the flurry of stuff that has come at American society, I'm incredulous that a lot of it has stuck on one hand. On the other hand, the fact that we have to come to some serious uh, contemplation of the bloatedness of agencies, and it's a how they should be tamed, not a whether they should go away. So again, I want to thank both of you. Say hello and salams to the women in your lives who I know and who are also dear to me. And I will be back at you, as they say, in a couple.
Okay. Thank you.
Got it, Amina. Love to see you. Great to see you. Catch up.
Ramadan Kareem.
Ramadan Mubarak. This is Professor Aminah Al-Deen for Critical Talk, a production of Sound Vision at Muslim Network TV. I hope you will join us for a series, and I'm going to ask the professors to stay on, but also to invite their classes to join us. And so I want to hear how students are interpreting what's going on. I want to thank all of you for being with us this evening. Assalamu alaikum, Ramadan Mubarak, Ramadan Kareem. Have a good rest.